You may know that right now in Rome, there's a meeting, the final month-long meeting of the Synod on Synodality, this multi-year process by which Pope Francis has asked the Church to come together at the local level and now concluding at the global level to talk about how we're going to be church together in the coming millennium. And to ask especially how do we create the structures that allow dialogue, that allow disagreement and argument and consensus in where we need to walk and journey together as a church to be a more missionary church. Now, why Rome? Well, your first answer will be, well, because the Pope lives there. But then, well, why does the Pope live there? And the reason in the Catholic Church is that that is where Peter and Paul are buried. Peter and Paul, the great apostles to the Jews and apostles to the Gentiles, these two pillars of the church, both were joined in martyrdoms in Rome. And in fact, the way the church thought of it often was that there were Christians in Rome before Peter and Paul showed up and were martyred there. But the thought is that they become the sort of foundation, the solid foundation for the continuing fidelity of the church in Rome. So the Pope is in Rome because of Peter and Paul, not the reverse. The Pope's important because of his leadership of this church founded on the mission of these two great apostles. Now, in today's first reading from Galatians, we get a sense of a little bit of how complicated that relationship can be. One of the big questions in the early church that we find lots of evidence of in the New Testament is whether or not people who are not Jewish, Gentiles, how much of Jewish Torah law do they need to observe in order to be part of this new Jesus community? Do they need to simply obey the moral laws as they understood them? Do they need to get circumcised and keep kosher? What parts of Torah observance are required? And if you remember some stories about Acts of the Apostles in Acts 15, the author there wants to paint a pretty clear but a little idealized picture of this beautiful meeting where all of the apostles and the whole church in Jerusalem and Peter and Paul and James show up and have a very civil conversation about how this is going to work. And that author provides a really excellent ideal and model for what synodality and church dialogue can be. Today in Galatians, we show there's maybe a few more wrinkles in the actual experience, some of the wrinkles that the author of the Acts of the Apostles might have smoothed out for us. We have this story where Paul is in one city and Peter shows up, and Peter has been eating non-kosher food with the non-kosher Christian community, but then some people from Jerusalem show up and Peter starts eating only kosher food with the kosher observant community. And we have Paul say, and when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he clearly was wrong. And we have this moment where Paul is critiquing his brother apostle Peter for Peter's practice. And there's a pretty much an argument here that shows a little bit more of just how human this conflict in the early church was. Now that gives me a lot of hope for two reasons. The first big reason is that it gives me a lot of hope about Peter and Paul, that here are two people that we honor as martyrs, honor as saints, honor as apostles, who are also really human. Peter seemed to be a little flip-floppy. Paul seemed to lose his temper. Becoming a saint for them was not getting rid of their personality or their humanity, but being a saint in and through their particular personalities and humanity. The other thing that gives me hope about, though, is the church. I think it's very easy to fall into a kind of idealization of the early church and think everything was great and then we somehow messed it up in our time. There were no arguments or dissensions or tensions or even conflicts in the church back when it first started, and we are in a worse off place. And this gives some good evidence. The church has always had conflicts and tension and some problems and some people with big personalities and ideas sometimes arguing with each other. Now, how they argue is the big key. And it's that how that makes me most hopeful for synodality and the current synod on synodality, and most hopeful for what the church can teach to the rest of our world, and especially our divided country. The how is this combination of clarity and charity. Paul is opposing him to his face. Paul is in other places is very clear about what he thinks should happen. Peter and James are very clear about what they think should happen and how the decisions should be made. And they come together in charity and in clarity to reach consensus on an answer. And because of that answer, the Christian community moves out and starts serving more in the Gentile world outside of the primarily kosher or Jewish communities in which it had first been raised. If we do that at every level of our church, if we do that here in our parish, if we're able to do that in our diocese, in the global church, in our region, and in our country, we might, as Catholics, be able to have a model for disagreement in love. One of the most famous icons that we have of Peter and Paul often shows them embracing, hugging each other. And that's the ideal, but it's also a model that we as Catholics, we as Christians might be able to give a increasingly divided world of how do we disagree in charity? How can we be clear about what we know and clear about our own opinions and experience while still being willing to listen courageously to another person? So, as you are encountering, as you will, because we may be part of the body of Christ, but the body of Christ is made up of us, humans, as you encounter conflict in your home, in your church, in your workplace, in your politics, in our global Catholic Church, we might ask for the grace for that charity to shine through. We might ask for the intercession of Peter and Paul to help show us how faithfulness to Christ is the most important foundation of our faith, and that because of that we can disagree with love as we discover together where should the church go and how should we walk together as one church.